Thank you, Leslie. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land and acknowledge the traditional owners. And the reason I'm here in Canberra is today was the ministerial meeting of the National Roundtable on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. So I feel like I've spent 8 hours preparing for a 15-minute presentation, so I'll try and condense it down. Now, apologies if my internet drops out. I'm just in the hotel room Wi-Fi, so hopefully that's it. Let me know and I can turn my camera off and keep going with the slides. But it is great to be here with you, with friends at AFTINET, so many familiar faces. I feel most welcome. So what I thought I'd start with is just to give you some insight into how the Modern Slavery Act has been working the last 3 years, and by way of example, the how we're responding at the Catholic Church, because the Modern Slavery Act applies to both for-profit and non-for-profit entities with a consolidated revenue of over 100 million per annum. So there's the 7 mandatory reporting criteria, and these, as Pat said, are all subject to review process at the moment. But I thought, we'll start with how it's working at the moment and then have a look at, the main sort of drivers for change are really criteria 4 and 5, which I'll talk quite a bit about, which is that reporting entities, as they're defined in the legislation, have to measure their effectiveness and also demonstrate continuous improvement. So it's not possible to put in the same modern slavery statement and submit that to the government register every year. So just by way of what my team and our role with the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, we basically operate as shared services and in-house consultants with all of these different reporting entities. So we have a risk management program that I'll take you through, but of those 51 participating in ACAN, 41 actually produce the modern slavery statement. So we actually report under the joint reporting mechanism of Section 14 of the Act. And so all 41 statements are uploaded as one document. So you can see here the executive summary. That's 48 pages in itself, aggregating all of the work that we do and stepping out the modern slavery risk management program across healthcare and health and aged care and education are the 2 biggest sectors, services and finance and investment. So that's 850 pages. So when people say, is what's happening with the Modern Slavery Act, I say, well, that's 14,000 hours of people's time doing looking at the risk of modern slavery in operations and supply chains. That would not have happened per annum if it wasn't for the Modern Slavery Act. So each of our entities produces their own individual modern slavery statement where they're addressing all of those 7 criteria. And then we conduct a lot of work where we aggregate and try and find common suppliers. We look at where the spend of the procurement spend is occurring across which sectors. So you can see of the 25 billion annual revenue, 8 billion is spent on goods and services. And then of that, 4 billion is just over 4 billion is spent on high risk areas. But, it's nearly 200,000 employees, 1,500 schools. There's 2 universities, 250 or so aged care centres and 66 hospitals are part of. So that's a lot of rubber gloves, a lot of solar panels, a lot of uniforms. And that's I suppose, in comparison, one of the things that we are hoping to change with the Modern Slavery Act review is to basically call on the Commonwealth to do the same thing that we're doing, which is each of our reporting entities have their own modern slavery risk management program that they're implementing, and they're producing a modern slavery statement, whereas the Commonwealth, despite the spend of some 70 billion per annum, this is the sole result of the reporting against the Modern Slavery Act by each of these government departments. So there's just over 100 words from the Department of Defence, which is really can do with a lot of improvement, because we've got the Diocese of Darwin can write 20 pages and implement a risk management program for just over 30 million spend, and Department of Defence comes up with 100 words. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. And this is basically the kind of first step in the Modern Slavery Act compliance is knowing what your risk is. So we have 11, we've looked at analysed our spend data and come up with 11 categories of spend. 5 of those are in labour related services, and then the biggest areas of spend, medical devices and supplies, and building and construction. But it's really facilities management and fitting out of hospitals and building new schools. That's where most of the spend. And then, of course, that's all very high level. So there's sort of like the inherent risk of the country, the commodity, the category of purchase. But then you come down to the individual suppliers. And of course, with something like rubber gloves, we've seen Ansell being in the US by 13 Bangladeshi workers who appear to have been subjected to forced labour in factories in Malaysia. They have multiple indicators that they were in debt bondage. They were just victims of deceptive recruitment. They weren't paid properly and that kind of thing. And we can see here solar panels. By comparison, Australia, is buying, I think it's something like 70% of solar panels from China in the Shenzhen area, where the likelihood of slave labour is extremely high with Uyghur forced prison labour. And at the same time, the US has stopped 1,000 shipments of solar panels from arriving into the US. The US government has stopped those solar panels landing in their country. At the same time, Australia is importing. So, one of the things we do is we're trying to identify a diversity of suppliers and other suppliers where the manufacturing practices are more transparent and are often onshore here in Australia. Another area that we're really trying to drive change is how can you measure improvement if you're not actually coming up with transparent data to demonstrate what you did last year, you've done better this year, you've done more. So we developed, so the Australian government still doesn't have any of these categories that they're reporting on at the Commonwealth level. So we developed these to be able to demonstrate that we are trying to engage with the high-risk suppliers. We're inviting them to webinars and seminars, completing surveys, and trying to really build a profile of suppliers so that we can have a strategy to do things like, to audits and find really where the risk is going from 10,000 feet right down to the factory floor. So we have a really comprehensive risk management program, and it's really not possible to comply with the Act without all of these elements. So, having leadership commitment, like the modern slavery statements have to be signed by the chair of the board, by the the statement has to be approved by the board, the date of the board meeting has to be published on the statement. So that high level commitment is right there. It's not possible to submit a modern slavery statement to the government online register without that CEO, chair level approval. And then, you know, you need to kind of, each reporting entity has to understand, you know, where they're at the moment. And it's no point in starting supplier engagement if you actually haven't got any of those policies and processes and practices embedded in the organisation. If there's not the internal awareness, people don't understand what they're meant to be doing. And then there's the supplier risk assessment, education and awareness raising. So each of our Catholic organisations has an internal modern slavery working group that's really comes from all across the organisation, because although this is a regulatory reporting requirement driven by legislation, it's the activities that are reported on in the modern slavery statement are actually activities mostly conducted by the procurement staff. So, but again, without the in-house legal counsel and the risk and governance people, comms, HR, all of the other parts of the organisation, finance, it's really hard to see where the spend, analyse the spend data without engaging with finance. So the modern slavery working groups are really the core to responding to the reporting obligations of the Act. And then as our role with ACAN is to provide all those template things like model roles and responsibilities and procedures, resources. We come up with the supplier questionnaire. We've got business human rights specialists who analyse the survey data. So the latest survey we've put out looks at the results of over 1,000 suppliers. And some of the interesting thing is that this really small number of large companies and very high number of companies with under 5 million turnover. So it looks as though a lot of expenditure of the Catholic Church, even though there's over 150,000 suppliers, it's going to, the contracts are with really small sole traders and smaller operators. So then we sort of use, we're working with SEDEX. The reason why we've gone with SEDEX, which is an ethical sourcing database, is because they're global. They have 65,000 members already. They have office in Japan and the Asia Pacific. And there's already, and this is the place where we keep all of the information about engaging with high-risk suppliers. So you can see there that Coles and Woolworths and Aldi and Officeworks, Bunnings, they're all part of SEDEX as well, because trying to collate surveys through Excel spreadsheets and keep them somewhere is literally impossible. So we use that as one of the tools. The other tool that we've developed in response to the Act is really looking at the pre-qualification supplier directory. So things like textiles. We've been working with the textile clothing footwear division of the CFMEU around carpet manufacture, identifying Australian-made carpet manufacture, and really encouraging those sort of high-risk categories of procurement to look at made in Australia as a way to lower the risk of forced labour and labour exploitation in supply chains, and also realising that the transparency that we have with goods that are manufactured in Australia is going to be much greater than trying to organise audits that happen overseas. We do the gap analysis. We've developed 5 e-learning modules. These have been rolled out to many thousands of staff across the country who are involved in this work. And we've also, part of the legislative requirement is to have, you have to explain what the remediation process is. So we have adopted a work of voice technology called Ulula. So that's an anonymous work of voice mechanism that we'll be deploying next year. And then we have a sort of a hotline for sort of pretty much 24/7 for any of our network if they have any concerns of, particularly in the operations, in the labour hire services area. We've really pushed out a lot of training and awareness on through our webinars and fortnightly meetings around the risk of people in cleaning, security, construction in Australia to being exploited. So we have an in-house remediation process to be able to talk them through how to safely engage with anyone who they think might be impacted. And of course, the main issue there is not making the situation worse by asking kind of the wrong questions. And just in I suppose today, hearing the Attorney General just reinforce the Labor government's commitment to wanting to strengthen the Modern Slavery Act. There's already drafting happening for the role of an anti-slavery commissioner, which we think will really help build some of that best practice, and not just leave it up to kind of individual companies to sort of find good suppliers. We really need leadership from the government on that. And so today was also great to hear from the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, whose remit includes New South Wales state government procurement in the same way that the Commonwealth is responding to the Act. So that's, I think, 15 minutes. So I just leave it there. Don't want to go over time.
Alison, thank you so very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you'd like to stop sharing the screen so we can have a look at the people, and we'd like to open up now to questions to both Pat and Alison. If you'd like to ask any questions, you've got two options. You can put a question in the chat, or we ask you to raise your hand. I don't know whether it might be easier if we stop highlighting the speakers so we can see everybody a bit more clearly on the screen. So are there any questions at the moment? Yes, Keith Suter, you're on mute, but if you'd like to come off mute and ask a question, thank you.
I don't want to ask a question, I just want to make a comment. I joined the Anti-Slavery Society in London almost 60 years ago, and I'm so inspired by this presentation, Alison. It's a lesson for all of us that you hang in for the long haul, and you can suddenly then begin to see the politicians change, the bureaucracy change, even business is giving in to all this pressure. So I found your presentation of 15 minutes incredibly inspiring. Thank you very much, Alison.
Thanks, Keith. It's very kind.
Yes, thank you, Keith. And I agree, it certainly was. I don't know if it's protocol, but I'd like to ask a question from the chair, if I can. Alison, can you give us an indication of which governments in the world are scoring well in terms of their response to modern slavery?
I think certainly Brazil had a really comprehensive system where the proceeds of crime, so where a coffee plantation or where there was forced labour found, the assets of that farm were often redistributed to the workers as part of compensation. So just really sort of things that we could dream for. Oh, look, it's hard to keep up. I mean, Canada's introducing legislation. I think Japan introduced something. One of the issues is that, there's always great things happening in the EU. It's what's happening in our region, the Asia Pacific region. So I'd have to say, when we analysed 1,500 modern slavery statements as part of a project with the Thomas More Law School at ACU, Australian Catholic University, we did find that multinational companies where they were headquartered in the Asia Pacific had particularly low, you'd basically say they failed, they didn't comply with the Australian legislation. I think that reflects that, that business and human rights hasn't made the same you know, steps forward in our region as it has in other parts of the world. But where else is, so the UK, they've just reviewed their act. They were obviously first to have a Modern Slavery Act of the transparency in supply chain legislation. But I think New Zealand's going to introduce legislation really soon. They've had a really extensive process. So companies are more and more global, multinational companies are having to respond to legislation all around the world. The EU will probably introduce, you know, the mandatory due diligence, and like when something is found, like for example, people exploited in the manufacture of rubber gloves, then you could see that that would have to be announced, and what's the process for remediation for those workers who are impacted, and that would become more of a requirement in a timely manner rather than the reporting regime we have, which is really, there's almost like an 18-month lag time potentially, because you've got your reporting year and then you've got 6 months to write your report on what you did in the previous reporting period. So the Commonwealth will put out their statement in hopefully by the end of the year, so we'll be able to see the third modern slavery statement. But I think the shorter answer is it's hard to keep up because there's so much going on the globally around the sustainability, sustainable development goals, and modern slavery is becoming more just the intersection of modern slavery and climate change and action on climate. So that sustainability piece is sort of growing as well. It's very fast moving, like to try and keep up with what companies are doing and reporting. And then you've got pressure from superannuation funds, you know, the work that NGOs like yourself do, think tanks, putting pressure on companies to do the right thing. It's all making a difference.
Thank you very much. I've got a question sent to me from Michael Waits, who asked me to ask on his behalf, because apparently he's in a noisy location, to thank you very much for the presentation. And his question is, one of the gaps we're experiencing is shaping organisational procurement policies that provide guidance on slavery. Do you have model policies for organisations to consider?
Yes, that's what how we've built a standard across our network, is by having templates and models of everything. So internal policies, contract clauses around the procurement procurement contracts with specific modern slavery clauses, which is more about you know, it's not saying we're going to come and do it, or we want to, you know, talk to workers or do any of that. It's just, you know, if there are concerns at some stage down the track, that might happen. And if a company doesn't want to sign those sorts of things, it's like, okay, what's going on there? But yeah, no, we've certainly got all of those, and it's pretty difficult to comply with the Act if you haven't got those things, those foundations in place. So if there are for the Nurses and Midwives Association, certainly love to have a chat about how we come together on the health and aged care sector. And I feel like we're sort of trying to drive change from the procurement side of things, and work with unions wherever possible, of course.
Thank you, Alison. I think Daniel Nicholson from the MWU, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. My question, Alison, you mentioned a piece of, this is down the weeds a little bit, but you mentioned a piece of software called Alula, I think. And
yes,
if I understood correctly, it was about supply chain mapping and labour rights in supply chains. I wondered if you could elaborate on a little about that, how it works, how it's deployed by people within your network, etc. Thank you.
So we're very much newcomers to Alula. It's a I suppose what we're looking for was a an anonymous way for workers to seek help. And actually the Textile Clothing Footwear Union gave a great suggestion to have just little cards with the QR code on the back, and something non-discreet, like on the front that doesn't say help card or slavery services here. But it's like where there's, for example, even in Australia where there's union sites, but you've got labour hire there as well, and maybe your coverage doesn't extend to those labour hire contractors. So it's something that even unions could like potentially hand to workers that aren't in your area, your remit, your area of coverage, because what happens to one group of workers impacts everyone on that site. So it's really a way of where not necessarily that scenario, but what we're going to work with is it could be construction sites where the employer, so one of the Catholic employers, says, actually, we want to roll out this worker voice mechanism on site. And it could be that the workers all have some induction where it's explained to them if they have any concerns, that they don't have to self-identify. They can, contact through this, app, Ulula, and somebody will answer their questions. So when those communications come in, we'll triage those. And then, of course, if there's anything that's, bread and butter union things, I didn't get my meal allowance, or, I didn't get the shift I wanted, then we'll, pass that on to you guys. But what we're looking for is the more extreme forms of labour exploitation. So where there's a sense of, eventually you kind of unpack the scenario with workers going back and forth, building a bit of trust, but it's where they've endured something that just doesn't sound right. Like, why would you stay in a job and not get paid for 6 months? Why are you still there? What coercive control is going on? So Ulula is just one piece of, many strategies to try and get to the most vulnerable workers at the bottom of supply chains and have a way for them to contact someone and ask questions or reach out for help. And that could be the local, parish church on a Sunday. It could be someone in their own migrant community. It could be somebody back in their home country who says, oh, I'll put you in touch with someone. So it's just one thing in a suite of a bunch of different ways of communicating with workers in a safe way where they don't get, there's no retaliation, because that's the thing that is so frustrating in this work, is like the number of stories of where somebody spots something in a workplace, and then instead of asking that worker or what's happened, why are you upset or whatever, they've gone straight to the contractor and said, oh, I can see some of your workers are upset. And of course, then you never see the workers again, and it's all like you've just made the situation 10 times worse than not saying anything at all. So so there's the education piece, and then there's some tools like Ulula, but certainly the best solution to reducing the risk of modern slavery is to have organised workers who have freedom of association and can be part of the union. And you guys are the inbuilt modern slavery solution, and that's what we keep telling everyone. But there's, we need more manufacturing in Australia to be able to really turn that around, and at least, we're going to push in that direction anyway.
Thank you. Just looking to see if you've got any more questions. Yes, Pat.
I'm curious about, at the moment, if you look at the corporations in Australia who are covered by the Act, I think it's over $100 million turnover. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So is there a push to, first of all, how many of those corporations are actually reporting? Because I've heard that it's not 100%. And secondly, is there a push to capture more smaller to reduce that cap so that you get more corporations who actually have to report.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 100 million threshold for us is it's sort of working. We've had 3 years of that. It's meant to filter down to your suppliers and your suppliers. There's still really not enough focus on operations. But as far as compliance rate, it is considered quite, the government considers it's quite high. I mean, this is where they need more data from the ATO to actually say who should be reporting and who shouldn't. Apparently, several hundred companies did get a please explain letter. And that you can kind of see that in the modern slavery register, because there was a peak of homework that was out of date, if you know what I mean. It's like they submitted their 2020 statement sort of 18 months late, and they think, I think you got your letter from the government to say you needed to report. But there's literally 4,000 companies that have put in modern slavery statements. Well, not for profits as well. I think lowering this, hearing from Commissioner John McMillan today, as he said, on many previous forums, there's almost a split around keeping the 100 million threshold and lowering it, and is split with civil society and business. It's not civil society saying one thing and business saying another thing. It's for us, what we look at is, 78% of the revenue goes straight to salaries. So if you're looking at a $110 million annual revenue, and you take out utilities and insurance and rent and those, it's just not really enough to kind of make it that much of a difference. I mean, we still try and encourage, like Catholic cemeteries have been reporting under the Modern Slavery Act, and they're only something like 25 million. But because they're building the new cemetery out at Western Sydney, and they're importing stone from high-risk countries, then they actually wanted to be part of the Modern Slavery Act. So there's, for organisations that want to do the right thing and don't want to have slavery and want to, make a difference, there's a voluntary option. And once you've reported once voluntary, you have to keep reporting. You can't just go, we're going to voluntarily do it this year and not next year. You're treated in the same way as a reporting entity. So we've got a bunch of under 50 million that are reporting under the Act. And then, I'm not sure about, we want to see better quality, and I'm not sure the threshold is the driver for that. I think more help from government around, the Australian government has no sanctions stopping anything made by forced labour coming into Australia, but other countries have got, the Uyghur laws prohibiting imports made by Uyghur labour and things like that. So there's other ways of strengthening it other than the threshold.
Thanks, that's very useful. And I think it also, again, links in with the trade aspect, because the current government has a policy saying that they will ban the imports of products from slave labour. So that's one of the things that we can make them accountable for. But certainly, if you have enforceable obligations in trade agreements, it does mean that if there is slave labour, you have the option of doing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, state government procurement with health, aged care, uniforms, construction, medical supplies, that would just make a huge difference if the state governments were going to do something. So here in the ACT, apparently the ACT government's made a commitment to a Modern Slavery Act as well. So that's really exciting. Some of the, did you do a submission, Pam?
No, we didn't have the resources to do a submission, I'm afraid. But we know some of our affiliated organisations did. We've got 60 member organisations.
Yeah, I mean, we just really pushed for things that were going to strengthen the Act, and you know what, I think business can go so far, but yeah, we need government to do a bit more. And it does seem to be there's a commitment for penalties from the government, so that should be interesting. Certainly, there is support for penalties for repeat, like companies that haven't refused to do a modern slavery statement. And then I think the other thing is around looking at, I suppose, sustainability outcomes in general, but just things like grants that go to the states for schools and things like that.
I've got a question in the chat from Nitsa Siano, who asks, can we do anything from a Labor Party branch and party units to support your work? Is there a motion we can pass and send to federal Labor? We have our national conference in August 2023 where policies are adopted in our platform.
Oh, that's a good idea. I mean, it's certainly, it was, you know, branch members here in Canberra that managed to get the ACT government to listen and take introduce, you know, commitments and new legislation. So I'm sure there's something around each of the states complying or acceding to the Commonwealth or doing something around their state procurement. It would just make a huge difference, because you think about Queensland at the moment, you know, all the Catholic schools and, you know, Mater and Mercy and all the Catholic health systems are all working hard to comply with the Modern Slavery Act, but this Queensland state government's not doing anything. So, yeah, it's that what we always want when we've got Labor governments, which is, you know, social procurement, looking at outcomes for, you know, making manufacturing in Australia and reducing the risk of modern slavery. And I think there's also there's so many ways that this work intersects with other legislation too. I mean, you've got the visa review, because that creates vulnerabilities in Australia for temporary migrant workers. If we can get rid of bonded visas, I mean, at the moment, all the Pacific Islanders are bonded labour when they're coming to work in the fruit. So they can't, if they leave an employer who's abusing them, they're immediately unlawful non-citizens and they have no right to find another job without going back to the Australian government and saying, you know, like, so it's, yeah, they don't have the same rights as we do. And I think that's something that would certainly help with that visa review that Labor's announced just recently. I think it was Andrew Giles has got coverage of that one.
Thank you. I've found the comments about modern slavery in Australia and our workers here, migrant workers here, very interesting. I understand there's been some work done in the UK revealing modern slavery activity in the disability support work area, for example,
Yes.
which is an area that my union covers. We are the disability union. So it's a really interesting area.
Yeah. In home care, definitely in home care workers are vulnerable. There's just thousands of ABN operators out there exploiting temporary migrant workers in that area for sure. It can be laundry workers, yeah, people in aged care. So many labour hire services doing bad things. So that was the other encouraging thing today, was just hearing that work is happening on the national licensing scheme.
And apart from people like us in forums like this, to which extent is there a publicity campaign, an awareness campaign to the broader community because obviously we've had the football, which has made a big impact and has made people more conscious and aware of what has happened, although it's amazing the appetite for tolerating thousands of deaths while we can still watch a football match. So I think it's important that we do continue that awareness through activism and organisations such as yours.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly business community conferences every week. I mean, I speak a lot to business on modern slavery, and there's a lot of people who've moved from might be aid and development work, it might be social work. They're actually now working in corporates in this area. It's you'd be surprised. It attracts passionate people even within business who want to make a difference and who have the backing of their leadership as well. I mean, if you want to read a good modern slavery statement, I mean, who'd have thought BHP would write an excellent modern slavery statement, but they have. So they finished their 5-year plan. I mean, I suppose when you've got more human rights abuses around the world, you're a bit more of an expert on what risk of modern slavery looks like. But the mining sector are certainly ahead. Coles and Woolworths are doing some good work. I think the business forums, the procurement professional business forums, law forum, like it really is pretty much on the agenda, and so many different forums like the UN Global Compact. I think the finance and investment side, it's great to see all the industry superannuation funds like CBUS and folks like that really driving a lot of the questions around the publicly listed companies. You know, what are you doing on sustainability? What are you doing on slavery? What are you doing on the environment? So that's really added to that momentum and pressure, because once a board gets letters from the shareholders, then they tend to pay attention.